Welcome to the Seafood Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jim Cowie. In each episode, I speak with industry leaders, fishery scientists, fishermen, and seafood chefs. We'll highlight the importance of seafood in our daily lives, economy, and environment. Whether you catch your own seafood, love cooking it, or want to learn more about where your fish comes from, you'll find it all here on the Seafood Matters podcast. If you enjoy this episode, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a 5-star review. And you can get in touch with me by visiting seafoodmatterspodcast.com. Nathalie Steins qualified as a senior marine social scientist. Since 2016, she's been a senior researcher and project leader at the Wageningen Marine Research and chair of the ICES Human Dimension Steering Group. In this episode, Nathalie shares her opinion on how Brexit has affected quota negotiations. She also explains how technologies are being used to collect scientific data and how an emerging generation of scientists are valuing the wisdom that can be obtained through closer working relationships with fishermen. Enjoy this altogether positive outlook for the future of the fishing industry with Nathalie Steins. Welcome to Seafood Matters podcast, Nathalie. I would just like to ask you, first of all, with the fish stock assessment advice prior to quota allocations, we start, the advisory advise 17% cut, and it finishes up 15%. Is that a bargaining position for negotiations? Is it an advisory? How does it all start and finish?
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep the distinction between, on the one hand, the scientific advice, and then on the other hand, the political decision about how high the quota are going to be. So the responsibility of ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, is to give an advice on fishing opportunities. And what they do is they answer a question that the European Commission, in this case, asks them. So they ask, for example, what would be the maximum allowable catch if you would base your management on maximum sustainable yield. So that gives ICES answers that question. It also gives a number of other options in the table, and then that goes to the European Commission. And once that's advice is handed over, then there's a whole process of negotiation where stakeholders, so fishing industry, NGOs, different member states, in the cases of shared stocks like cod, for example, it's the UK, it's the European Union nowadays. They have to negotiate in the end what's going to happen with the advice. And sometimes the managers, they decide to stick to the advice, and sometimes they go lower or higher. And in that respect, they also take into account all kinds of social and economic considerations that the ICES advice doesn't take into account, because ICES only advises on biological considerations.
Yeah, it's obviously concerning for fishermen, because obviously it has a direct effect on their livelihoods and running their businesses.
Absolutely.
And when you say scientists and fishermen closing the gap between science and fishing, that's fishermen don't always see it that way, but they certainly see it as a definite step in the right direction.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, also when you just going back to your question about the ICES advice and the setting of the quota, ICES obviously works on the basis of the best available knowledge. And we do have stocks for which there are uncertainties, and because, for example, there are not enough data. And in the past, there would always yeah, there would often be these situations where fishers would blame the scientist for quota levels, which is not the responsibility of scientists. But of course, scientists do have a responsibility to make sure that the best available information is used. And I think recently we've really seen that scientists and fishers have much more appetite to actually work together to make sure that ICES does get these, the best available data. And maybe if I can use an example, we had a situation in the Netherlands where I am from about 20 years ago, where the scientists and the fishing industry really, yeah, the relationship wasn't really good because the fishers basically said, well, scientists, you have it all wrong with your stock assessment for the main commercial species, plaice and sole in the Netherlands. And the scientists were like, yeah, but this is these are the data, this is the model. So, and we don't set the quota, so you can't blame us. And we started to have this research collaboration where the industry actually, we invested a lot of time in relationship building. And the industry realized that, for example, the discards data, so that's the data on the undersized catches in the model for plaice, were really, really poor. And this was because there was only money for 10 scientific research trips per year. So you can imagine that is a very small part of the effort of the whole fleet. So then the fishing industry asked, like, can we help you? And we actually set up a self-sampling program, which after some improvements, and you have to learn by doing, resulted in the conclusion that the self-sampling data by the industry were as good as the data that the scientists were collecting, but also they had much more coverage and much more quantity. So nowadays, in the stock assessment for plaice, for example, we use the self-sampling data from the fishing industry because they're so much better than the scientific data. And that process really helped our relationship, and we really have a thriving science industry research collaboration now. And it's really nice also to see that this is also picking up in other countries. So also, for example, in the UK, scientists and fishers are working increasingly together.
Yeah, it's well, it's concerning quite a lot of the fishermen, and especially in you could say well Scotland in the whole, but mainly northeast and north, is they're getting caught out in a few different ways, but not by any ways are they blaming scientists, and it's not all negative, but it's got impacts. Now, one of them is the just exactly from the points you've made. They have a monkfish reduction this year, and they talk about data poor. They've finished with a small increase. They got a small increase in cod, but they're putting a north. They're putting a west coast. They're starting a west coast quota this year. So some of the cod that the increase in cod in the North Sea that fishers expected to get for this year, they won't be getting so much of anything now because they're opening the west coast and it's going in there. But they see it as a step forward, although in the short term they're not going to enjoy the increase they thought they would get, but they can see it's making progress. Also, species like ling was swapped with Norway. Saith was swapped with Faroe. So there's there's a lot of different factors coming in, and quite a number of them are impacting their profitability.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that we see in the fisheries, well, all over Europe nowadays. And yeah, it's sometimes it's difficult, because of course, what fishers want in the first place is to keep their business going, and then very often, collaborating with scientists is not necessarily top priority. Also, when it sometimes costs them money, yeah, because of course it takes time to collect samples, for example, or to do measurements, and if fishers are they're not compensated for it, and they don't really see the short-term benefit, it's quite difficult, because it's also one of the things that we've encountered is that fishers very often expect in these research collaborations where we start collecting data together that the results will be immediate. But many of the scientists, for many of these stocks, for example, you need time series of at least 5 years before data can be useful for the model. So it's actually an investment that doesn't really pay back immediately. And of course, also, it's not necessarily the case that when the data improve, that your quota advice goes up. There is no guarantee, that when there is better data, that there is also uh, a higher quota going to be the result. So the only guarantee you can give is that there is a better stock assessment with less uncertainties. So
Yeah.
that makes it complicated sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you, the other factor coming into play is with the Brexit impacts. It's greatly helping the pelagic side, but not the demersal. And of course, you could imagine the demersal won't see that as the rich uncle is getting more than the poor cousin.
Yeah, I think the Brexit is. I mean, it's in the end. I think it hasn't. I think the outcome hasn't been good for either the fishers in the UK nor the fishers in the European in the European Union. Because in the end, I mean, it's about you have to manage those stocks. For example, if you talk about the North Sea, you have to manage them together, and that also means that as stakeholders, you have to. That you have to work together, and with the Brexit we had, of course, the advisory councils that were actually playing a really good role, I think, in European fisheries management. And of course, when with the Brexit, the UK had to leave the advisory councils. We've as an active member, so they can be observers, but that's of course a very different role. And also, in cases where where we have situations where there's quota owners from different countries who had quotas in the UK, for example. I think also, that collaboration that in the past was quite good has gone down a little bit. So I think Brexit is a real shame, because I think a lot of promises were being made, particularly also to the UK inshore fleet, that the government now can't keep up with. And I think a lot of relationships have been damaged, and I think that's a really sad situation, actually.
I have to say I agree with you. And fishermen they were seen, at the end of the day, Natalie, they bought into something they could see. They were told and they could see that it was going to be a benefit to them. But if you don't mind me using the term, they were shafted. And I think between all the documentation and extra costs to put fish into Europe now and not getting the benefits they were hoping as an island nation and with their own fishing grounds ownership, they lost the best part. No, they lost the best part of being a member and got the worst part.
Yeah, it certainly made also the quota setting much more complicated now. And the problem is, of course, you can't. the fish know no boundaries, so it's a resource that you have to manage together, and it's just more complicated if you're not like in the same group.
There
So
is
yeah,
consensus of opinion in what you say there that I think fishermen don't possibly see it, not arguing with ICES, but they don't see it whether you're, and when I was speaking with Mark Dickey Colas, he was, no, we're talking about the cod, as we were saying there just now, but when you talk about North Sea cod, it takes in southern part of the North Sea, mid North Sea, I think even the Baltic, and and now because our fishermen are seeing lots of fish, lots of cod around the Shetland waters, but they were not getting the increase felt they should have got because of the effects of the downside in other places, which they didn't see quite fair.
yeah. Yeah, I think the good thing is that we talked about the Brexit, and um, the Brexit hasn't really affected the scientific collaboration that much. So the UK is still part of ICES. The UK is still doing their surveys. They're collecting the data also from the fishing industry, and all so in that sense, it's business as usual within ICES. But I think the impact on in the end the negotiations that are based on ICES advice, that has really complicated things a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would like to just go forward and ask you. You mentioned in a paper, is it CIRC?
Yeah,
Is it pronounced SIRC?
correct.
What can you tell me what is that?
Well, it's basically the abbreviation for science industry research collaboration. And yeah, it's something that we are seeing in recent years happening more and more often, that fishers really have a clear appetite to actually collaborate with scientists, but also to take the lead in um, coming forward with all kinds of data and setting up research programs. And they often do this in collaboration with scientists, either because scientists from their own institutes, but it could also be scientists who are, for example, employed by the fishing industry. So, like the Scottish Pelagics, for example, they have Steve Mackinson, who is employed as their science officer. And when you have when you have this relation between scientists and fishers, and a willingness to collaborate, then often we get really nice projects. And we also see this with the new generation of scientists. They really want to work together with the fishers because they realize that fishers are basically, our eyes and ears at sea, yeah? Because we can't be at sea all the time. It's very expensive for a scientist to go to the sea all the time, and fishers are at sea all the time. So they see things, they know things, and in these CIRC projects, science industry research collaboration projects, we can actually try and get the most out of the knowledge that fishers have, and the opportunities they provide. And this could either be collecting data that you can measure, like how many cod do fishers catch, or what's the size of the cod that they catch. But it could also be knowledge that they have from experience, about which areas are good spawning areas, for example, or um, uh, where are there? We also had this project about vulnerable species, like where are these located, and if you want to reduce your impact on vulnerable species, which areas should you perhaps avoid in certain times of the year. So that's also knowledge that could be very useful for scientists.
And it's interesting in what you say there, and I'm just wondering if there's a link with this science. What did you call it? Science
Science industry research collaboration.
Research collaboration, and some of the fishermen, depending on the producers' organisation they're members of, they've got group apps, and if they go to an area and get a particular species, they'll put it on the app so that the producers, the PO, producers organisation, are collating all this information, which I think is, anything like that is using technology and going forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think, one of the things that we experienced, because we did together with a group of international colleagues, I looked at these science industry research collaboration projects and how effective they are, for example, and how much they are used. And one of the things that is really important is that when you, as an industry, if you start collecting your own data, you have to really talk to the scientists who are going to use the data, because, for example, for stock assessments, ICES needs data in a very specific format. So it's always really, really good when fishers think about, okay, we want to collect data, we want to contribute to, for example, improving a stock assessment or whatever. Talk to your scientists in your institutes as well, so that we can make sure that the data that are being collected also meets the criteria that ICES, for example, or your national institute uses. Because otherwise, it's a shame. Fishers can come, with a lot of data, and then maybe they're not usable because just one thing was forgotten, for example. So that's
Yeah,
that's a really important lesson, and that's also why I always really encourage fishers who want to start collecting their own data to work together with a scientist, so that these things that can be avoided are actually avoided from the beginning.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So possibly there's either a link with the producers' organisations and this circ.
Yes, and I think, sometimes maybe the producers organizations, they have these apps for a different reason, not necessarily for collecting data for science, but, for example, um, to know where there is where there's areas with lots of undersized fish, so that they can warn fishers, like, please avoid these areas these weeks, right? So then the objective of the data collection is very different, but maybe with a little tweak, these data could also be used in science. So that's also, I think, why it's good also as a PO to, when you start to collect data, maybe for management purposes. It would be interesting also to have a chat with your local scientists to see if these data could also be used by scientists to improve stock assessment or knowledge about the stocks. Because in the end, the more data and knowledge we have, the better the stock assessments are going to be.
Yeah, yeah. One of the other species that I know a particular friend of mine was talking about, they give information on this app, was dogfish.
Hmm.
So the area they caught them, and obviously they have a quota, so they are allowed to catch them, but maybe not everybody, and so many of them would want to avoid them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good example.
yeah.
And that's also a species where uh, uh, ICES doesn't really have a lot of data about. So, the data that is collected via apps could be potentially be really interesting.
Oh well, hopefully that maybe mean that Seafood Matters podcast could be making a contribution to the.
That would be nice.
Yes, I would love to think that we were helping it. Going from that, it's interesting when you say there about undersized fish. What would your, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just your views, because one of our earlier podcasts was with a fishery scientist from Iceland called Jon Christensen, and he was telling us he did some studies and surveys in the North Sea, and he felt that I'll put it the way he put it. He was on the fish market in Peterhead. There was haddock, obviously, from a Icelandic point of view. He said that they were like herring, because
Hmm.
obviously they were much smaller than they would have in Iceland. And he did a age test. You know, the bone, I think there's a bone in the head they took out. He did an age test, and the fish were between 4 and 5 years old. And that was the size. They were just about the third legal size, about 30 millimeters. He said, if that fish of that age was caught in Iceland, it would have been over 2 kilos in weight. But also, he felt that they should be fished out because they were. The problem is that if we increase the mesh size, there's going to be more of that year stock left in the sea, and they're going to compete for the available food.
Yeah, well, I am not to be honest. I'm not a biologist, but I do know from from my colleagues that there's many species in the North Sea who are actually well, their growth is basically lagging behind. So normally they would have been bigger at the age they have in the in the past. They would be bigger compared to now at the same age. Yeah, it's not completely clear where this is coming from. It could be that there is less nutrients. It could be that there is competition between fish stocks. Yeah, it could be all kinds of factors that. But as I said, I'm not a biologist, but I do know that we actually don't know. We only know the tip of the iceberg, what's happening with fish stocks and growth and how the species interact. Also the impacts of climate change, of maybe reduced plankton levels in the water. So yeah, it's something I think that we should look much more into.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I can't give you an answer, I'm afraid, because I'm a social scientist. So I only know because I work with fishermen and I work a lot with fisheries biologists. I have a little bit of knowledge, but I wouldn't dare to answer this question.
No, sorry, I didn't.
Don't worry.
I didn't mean it in a question, putting you on the spot. I just wondered, what have you had a
Yeah.
view on it? That's
Yeah.
all.
I think,
What I thought was so interesting was the fact that that fish would have been absolute maximum about 400 to 500 grams, and there's Jon saying if that was in Iceland, it would have been over two
yeah.
kilos. I thought that
Yeah.
was alarming.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see the same with other species. And I think, one of the things is that, of course, what we're doing in many of the European seas, also in the North Sea, is that we manage the fisheries based on single stocks. So the quota are all set for a specific stock, but we know there is interactions between species, and that we also know there is interactions with the ecosystem and nutrients on fish stocks. So what we really should strive for, is an ecosystem-based approach to the management of the fish stocks. But that is something that is really, really difficult to implement in the North Sea. Not only because we don't have all the science is not all ready for it, but also because it would mean that the whole, common fisheries policy, for example, may have to be changed to do these things, to get away from single stock management and looking, for example, more at mixed fisheries management, which is very, very complicated, and which would also probably have impacts, on and fishing opportunities for fishers. So there's a lot of complications with this, not only in the science but also on the management side of it.
Yeah, that's interesting because
Yeah.
I had a podcast just a couple of weeks ago with a guy, I think you know him very well, Mike Park.
Yes.
And Mike said, I said that to him because Mark Digicolis mentioned the mixed fishery, and he thought that was not a area, not a direction he was comfortable with going, because he felt with it being mixed, he says it would all be based on the lowest species.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how it works now. So basically, the weakest link in the chain, basically. So your lowest quota species, once that is being exhausted, you would have to stop the rest of the fishery, which is obviously socioeconomically uh, could be potentially really dramatic for fishers. So that I think, if you want to go for this ecosystem-based management and mixed fisheries management, we really have to rethink our whole way of managing the fisheries, and that may even be managing without quota, but managing basically maybe on based on efforts. But you can imagine, if you start doing this has huge repercussions for fishers, because people, for example, in cases where fishers have bought quota, where there's individual transferable quota systems, um, you would suddenly take their value of their business away from them. It could have potentially, yeah, maybe fishers would have to invest in new fishing gears and all those kinds of things. So the impacts of moving to a different system are just really, really big. So I can really understand the reluctance with managers and also with the fishing industry to to start thinking about these alternative management systems.
Do you have a position on what you feel about when we're talking about mixed fisheries and going in the lowest quota species and what's weakest link? Have you any views on predator stock?
Yeah, that's a whole other thing that you have to keep in mind, because there's also fisheries biologists who say, well, if a predator stock is becoming too big, you should fish a little bit more of the predator stock, so that the other species that are eaten actually can grow. And there's a lot of that's also, I think, part of ecosystem based management. And of course, in the mixed fishery now it works like it's the weakest link, but there is also um, I know that ICES, the Mixed Fisheries Group, has developed these models where you can actually sort of look for the optimum of fishing of all the species in a different mixed fisheries, where maybe some of the species will suffer a little bit, but where your main species, where fishers could still sort of fish for their main species, and then some species maybe would be underutilized, but you would have to find a balance, basically, and finding that balance is difficult, because it's not only about the biology of the stocks and how they interact, but it's also about the socioeconomics behind it.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
It is, yeah. And one of the things that is complicated as well is that there is no real targets for social and economic objectives in the common fisheries policy. So in the European common fisheries policy, there are things are being said about social and economic considerations that they can be taken into account, but there are no clear targets for it. And if there's no clear targets, it's really, really difficult to develop fishing advice where the different trade-offs, between different quotas are made visible. Because in the end, it's a trade-off, right? Do you want to have more employment at the expense of maybe a fish stock not recovering as fast as it could? Or do you think, well, this fish stock is in such dire straits now that you really want to go for maximum recovery at the expense of, maybe employment? Um, And to make this trade-off analysis, you really need, well, first of all, you need data, social and economic data, but you also need some reference points or objectives for social and economics. And we do have these reference points and objectives for the stocks, but we don't have them for fishers and for fishing communities, for example. So for the socio-economic part.
Yeah,
And yeah.
I know one of the concerns with this area, with the fishermen, is when we talk about predator stock and its complexities, as they say, it can't just be governed by mesh size. They say, because if you are increasing the mesh size or to let immature, you white, just say immature cod and haddock escape from the net. Well, with the different size of the different species, when you're letting an immature cod, or say cod, ling, haddock escape, you're letting a mature whiting, because they
Yes.
are generally smaller, so that's a more mature whiting. So you're doing with letting the smaller immature cod, smaller cod and other species escape is food for the mature whiting.
Yeah, and that's also one of the big challenges, of course, in the mixed fisheries is how do you um, devise fishing nets that actually are so selective that you still retain the catch that you want to catch, but release the other stuff. I mean, that's a puzzle. I think that's fishers and fishing gear technologists have been trying to resolve for the past for 50 years already, and it's just super super difficult. um, yeah. And I think also that requires collaboration between fishers and between scientists, but it also requires um, that in the end, when I think the problem is with many of the uh, um, escape panels and escape release panels that are being developed, and some of them are super selective. So, for example, in the nephrops fishery, we have developed a couple of adaptations to the existing nets that really result in a reduction of unwanted bycatches of smaller fish. But there is always still a little bit of your wanted catch that you lose. And when we then talk to fishers about this, they say, well, it would be okay if everybody else would use this, and there would be a level playing field, because if all the fishers lose a little bit of their marketable catch, then it's okay. We will get used to it. We know that everybody is suffering a little bit, but that's very very difficult to achieve, because if you want to have the same the same escape panel, for example, like not all the fishing vessels and nets are the same. So a panel that works in one of the vessels doesn't necessarily have to work very well in another. And then we get to EU. The EU says, okay, we can put this in our technical measures regulations, which takes a lot of time. And then, of course, there's always fishers saying, but it doesn't work in our fishery. So can we please have an exemption? So that's really, really, really difficult. Then the level playing field is also gone. So there's quite, it shows how complicated fisheries really are. And what I sometimes see is that we try to manage fisheries in this one way suits all, one fits all way. And that's not gonna work, because even within fisheries that fish for the same species, that's fast changes, so fast differences. So I think if you want to make change, you have to do that together with the group of fishers, at least, to fish with the same, with in a similar fishery, similar nets, similar gears. And also maybe there's something that could be done with with market rewards, because we also talked, I also talked to fishers as part of a study I did, and they say, well, if we would get rewarded, for example, by getting extra money for our fish, compared to those fishers who who don't do the extra bit, it would be fine as well. But in the end, the market doesn't, the buyers don't differentiate. For them, it's all nephrops, in this example that I just gave, that go to the auction. And if a fisher puts in this, this selective escape panel, it costs him money, costs him time, but he doesn't get any, financial reward for it either.
I'm just wondering, when you mention about a comment about the gear, I'm just wondering if maybe you're thinking, and something about. I've just recently been doing a podcast with a girl from Fisheries Innovation and Sustainability, Cara Brightson, her name is, and she talked about smart roll. Do you have any knowledge of?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Well, seemingly what they're working on with smart roll is that the skipper will be almost sitting on the bridge of the wheelers of his boat, and he can be watching the net, and they can control whether, if it's a species they have no quota for, that they can escape.
Oh well, that would. I think that's something that would help a lot of fishers, if you could see underwater what's happening in your net, and then decide on whether you're going to release the catch. I think that would be super beneficial. And I know in the pelagic fisheries, one of my colleagues is actually working on something similar, so that you can see in the net what's there, and then the skipper can decide to either let the catch go or bring in the net.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think nowadays with like the advanced camera technologies that we have, this is becoming increasingly possible. Particularly when it's not, when the underwater, when the view is clear. I mean, when it's very, like in many of the bottom trawls, for example, when sediments are being stirred, it's very dark in the nets, so it's really difficult to actually see something with a camera. But maybe in future there will be other ways of, of distinguishing those different species. I think that's one of the great things about technology, that it offers all these kinds of new opportunities and new ways of thinking as well, about how to fish.
Yeah. I know, going back some time ago, one of the concerns with the mesh was even fish escaping, they would maybe lose scales or get damaged when they were wriggling out, and really some of them just would not survive, even although they did escape.
Yeah, and that would, of course, that would be another way of approaching it. If you can't organize the escape of the smaller fish underwater, what could you do to increase the survivability of the fish that is actually hauled on board, and then is being and then is being put overboard, if that's allowed, because of course the discards ban that we have. But that's something that we are looking into as well. So, for example, one of my colleagues for the demersal fisheries, the beam trawl fisheries in the Netherlands, he's working on this gear. It's called the kiwi pit, and if you wonder where the word kiwi comes from, it's actually something that was developed in New Zealand in the pelagic fisheries. And it's basically what is happening is that they don't the cod end of the vessel of the net is actually a big bag. So the fish is being brought alive on board in a bag of water. So it's and there in the bag of water there are already escape holes where the fish where smaller fish could actually escape underwater, but all the fish that can't escape is being brought on board in a big bag with water. And then can be released. It's not damaged because it's actually still swimming, and the small fish can be released super quickly. And that's something, and we can see that the condition of the fish that comes on board, the undersized fish, is very, very good. So the chances that the fish has a high survival rate are quite high. So this is something that we are now experimenting with together with fishers, and we really hope that we found another part of the puzzle in reducing the impacts of mixed fisheries on stocks.
It sounds almost like it's reassuring and exciting that there's so much. I would say it's using technology and taking it forward, because the only thing that I have a wee bit of a problem with the bag at the end of the net is how there can be holes to let small fish escape, but it still retains water.
Yeah. Of course, the water, of course, eventually goes. I think the main problem is, of course, the stability of the vessel, right? Because if you have a bag of water that you have to bring up, that's quite a thing. So that's one of the issues that they are looking into right now. But in the end, everything that is not needed, so like the water and the undersized fish, goes back overboard. So of course there is challenges with with safety and things. So but the idea was, first, let's try it out, see if it works if we can get it to work in the demersal fisheries, because it's a very different concept, of course, compared to the pelagic fisheries, where this kiwi pit was originally developed for. But so far, initial results are looking quite good.
That's really fantastic to hear that. Can I quote from one of your papers? Uniqueness of fishers' knowledge, utility of fishing industry's contribution to science.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about, so getting back to this science industry research collaboration, what scientists do want to have, I mean, that's what their models are based on, are figures, right? Of things that you can actually measure. So, for example, the length of a fish, how many fish of a certain species fishers have caught, things like that. And a lot of the science industry research collaboration actually focuses on those kind of, collecting these kind of observational data. But there's also and these measurable data like length of fish and quantity and numbers. That's something that the scientists can put into the models and can become part of a stock assessment. But of course, fishers also have this unique knowledge that they have gained because of their lifelong experience of being a fisher, and very often this knowledge is being transferred from father to son. And this information is basically, it's in fishers' heads, basically. And it's not necessarily easy to put it in numbers. So fishers know very well in what times of the year, for example, they can find certain fish species in which area. They know when the wind is from a certain direction at a certain strength. You better not go out fishing for this species because then you won't catch anything. So all that kind of information that they know, that can be super useful also for scientists. But it's very difficult for that unique knowledge to actually be used into current fisheries science and into stock assessments. And very often I get this, when I talk to my fisheries biologist colleagues, and I say, oh, well, I've been talking to these fishers, and they have noticed this happening. I very often get the answer, yeah, sorry, we can't do anything with that because that's anecdotal evidence. And it's almost as if this is then sort of dismissed. And of course, anecdotal evidence doesn't mean that it's not true or that it's less true. It means that it has not been collected in a systematic way. And this is something I think that social scientists really can help with, because we have been trained to collect these evidence or experiential knowledge that fishers have in a way that we could make it accessible to also to fisheries scientists. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we are currently facing. There's a lot of knowledge out there that could be super useful for science and also for management. But how do we get it from from the experiential level that is of the fishers into reports and into into the science? And it's interesting because in many other countries, like for example, if you look at, uh, uh, for example, Africa, Asia, areas where the stock assessments are just and the potential to collect data is maybe the capacity is not as good um, as it is in our part of the world. A lot of experiential knowledge of fishers is actually being used by scientists and by managers, and proves to be super useful. And I think it has something to do also with these different value systems. Like here in the West, we want to have things measured and put in numbers, and if it's not in that format, there is this feeling, it's maybe not good enough. But on the other hand, we see that in many areas where ecological knowledge from fishers has been used in Asia, Africa, also with Native American First Nations, for examples, that knowledge has proved to be incredibly useful and a really good basis for management as well. So I really think we need to start changing our thinking in our advisory systems.
I completely agree with every word you've said there, Natalie. The one concern about it going forward here is the fear is if there's a downturn in the fishing and in the industry here and less boats, the fear there's going to be less and less young people coming. There are less and less young people being attracted to become fishermen, and the fear is all that knowledge you talked about there. It could be a generation thing, and it's gone.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
there's a real genuine fear of that.
I completely agree, and we are actually seeing this already. And I think that's why it's so important that social scientists start documenting this knowledge so that it doesn't get lost. And the problem there is, of course, you're doing that science. We need funding to do that, and a lot of most of the funding actually on fisheries is actually going to biological data collection. So also, within ICES, we want to start getting these sort of human dimension aspects more into the science and the advice. But the problem is that there is hardly any funding for social scientists to participate in fisheries science, and I think that's something that is really needs to change. So I hope it will. And I share your concern about knowledge getting lost. Because, I mean, it's one thing that we are facing, for example, now, going to my own country in the Netherlands, we've just had a decommissioning scheme where 50 beam trawlers have been decommissioned, which is a large part of the fleet. It's more than 1/3 of the Dutch beam trawl fleet is now being decommissioned. And the decommissioning scheme was done in such a way that it's going to be very, very difficult for younger skippers to actually return into the fishery, because the quota was decommissioned as well. And also, you're not allowed to enter the fishery for the next 5 years. So it's going to be super difficult to actually come back as a fishers if your dad has now decommissioned
Yeah.
its vessel. And that also meant that the not only the knowledge gets lost, but it also has a huge impact on fishing communities. So for example, in the north of the Netherlands, the port of Den Helder, the auction had to close because the entire Den Helder fleet and also the Texel fleet who landed at that auction have completely decommissioned. It also meant that the fishing co-op had to close. So it also means, that a lot of the community around fishing has completely changed, and we were very lucky in the Netherlands. Although I think it's a really sad thing that we had to do that, was that our government actually gave us, so a couple of social scientists, funding to actually document what was going on in these communities, so that the knowledge, so that wouldn't get lost. And it's sad, right? That this has to be documented in a way, but if we don't document it, it will get lost forever. And I think fisheries the coming years are going to have massive changes. So I really hope that social scientists all over Europe and also the UK, I include the UK in that as well. So Europe as a region, can start documenting communities, how they relate to fisheries, so that information and knowledge doesn't, and also the knowledge that fishers have, so that it doesn't get lost.
You know, what you've said there about your own situation in Holland, it's absolute same in Scotland. We have some of the, I mean, one of my home ports here, I'm only less than 10 miles away from it. Wick was pre-war, just after the war, it was the biggest herring port in the world. It's now a yacht marina for pleasure boats.
Yeah.
And if any fishing boat wants to come into Wick to land their fish now, they have to get permission because it's not a designated port any longer. And the other thing which resonates with what you said, we used to have a rule of thumb. Obviously, I'm retired out of the industry directly now, but we used to have a rule of thumb with the industry. For every fisherman at sea, there were 7 jobs ashore. Between the selling, the buyers, the lorry drivers, the filleters, fish shops, there'd be 7 jobs ashore for every one at sea. So, as you said, it has a massive impact on coastal communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. See, when your workshop discussions, Nathalie, you mention the uniqueness of fishers' knowledge and integrity of science. Do you link that together?
Yeah, it is somehow linked. I mean, when you talk about science industry research collaboration and using data that have been actively collected by the fishing industry, so outside, the sort of the statutory data like logbook information that is being used in fisheries science, there is sometimes concerns that if the people who actually rely on the science bring in the data, that the data could be somehow tainted, right? So it's in a fisher's interest, of course, that he gets as much quota as possible, and if then the science that is used by the politicians to set the quota, if the data for that science actually comes from the industry, there are certain parties who could who voice concerns about this. They say, well, the integrity of science could potentially be damaged because it's basically interest groups who are producing the data, and it's in their interest, of course, to produce data that are in their favor. So this is not my opinion, but this is something that that is being voiced. So that's a concern that you have to take seriously. So we looked with a group of scientists at the evidence for situations where, for documented evidence, where data perhaps had been tampered with, or where the industry clearly had a conflict of interest with the data, to see if this was really a big problem. And well, in the whole documented evidence of ICES, we could only find one example where something like this had happened. So it could be a concern. It is a concern, but it's not necessarily a big problem, and it's a problem that you can address. Also, at the same time, I think it's really, really important to point out that the data that scientists produce are also not perfect, right? There can also be there's all kinds of problems with some of the data that we have, for example, because there's not enough money to collect sufficient data, and these data are still being used because it's the best thing that we have. So it's not only it's not only, you know, if fishers collect data that they may not necessarily be completely perfect. The same goes for scientists. And the bottom line is, whoever collects the data, you just have to make sure that there is a really good quality assurance system. And that's something that can be arranged. So, for example, I previously gave this example of Dutch fishers who collect discards data, so data about undersized catches. So what they do is we have 25 fishers who collaborate in this system, and every once in a while we ask one of them, can you take 2 bags from your catch? So they have to take, they have to take ungraded catch, fill it back, and they will bring it back to this to land. We pick it up at the auctions, and we do then, we do all the measuring of the catch composition, the size, and all that kind of stuff. And there's colleagues from outside of our from other countries say, oh, but how can you trust the fishers that they don't fill the bag with only discards that are very, very big in size, or they keep certain species out or whatever. And we said to them, well, first of all, you also, you don't have this program, and you expect fishers to trust your data. So why wouldn't we trust their data? And also, what's happening is that we have an observer program still as a validation. So we do go out on trips still, and what we actually see is that the data that the fishers collect are there's no differences between the data that we collect. So there is no reason for any suspicion whatsoever that these discard samples that the fishers takes are somehow tampered with. And we also have a very open discussion with the fishers about, because when they would tamper with the data, we can actually see it, and it's just not in their interest, because they get a small financial compensation. If the sample is not handed in the way it should be, they won't get that, right? And we also tell them, like, if you hand in bad samples, we cannot use it, and it means that the stock assessment has just not, the data are just not as good. And if you can keep that discussion really open, then there really is no need to start worrying about these things. And I think, people who say this, like, yeah, but if you let fishers collect data, it will impede on the quality of the science and also with the integrity of the science. I think they haven't really had that experience of working with fishers about. They don't have that experience. They don't think about ways how you could validate it, which we have. And usually, if you start entering a discussion with them, then people will understand. But it is, you need to make sure that there's good quality assurance, but that's irrespective of who collects the data. I mean, I also expect that my colleagues adhere to quality standards, when they collect data. So we should treat them all in the same way.
Yet again, I agree with you. And what I was going to suggest was this, which I'm absolutely sure it's the same with your industry, the fishermen in Holland, is the way fishermen here view that now, and the way they would see the response to what you said there, Natalie, is every fisherman that's left now is heavily, heavily committed financially with some of them, their grandfathers, fathers, and sons. Their whole families are involved. And their answer to anybody criticizing, asking that is, why, what is it not in our interest to do anything but do it properly, because it is their future.
Of course, it is, and I think that's also why it's really. I think it's really interesting. I think for fishers as well to get involved in these sort of projects, because it's about, it's about their future. And I think we should never forget that. And also, to me, when you work with fishers in collecting data, we often start to, people have this sort of, it's them and us, right? But it's us together who work on these data and on collecting the information. So I think and I think that's a really nice thing. And it's about trust as well. Eh? It's about trust in each other, about each other's motives as well. And the more you work together with fishers, the better that level of trust happens. And of course, it doesn't always mean that we are in agreement, right? But and you don't have to be. I mean, even when you with your best friend or with your life partner, you don't always have to be in agreement. But you have to be able to trust one another in such a way that you can actually talk about your difference and also accept that maybe someone has a different view on things. And I think that's one of the really nice things when you establish this, when fishers and scientists establish this relation of trust together, then a lot of a real new world starts opening. I think for both of them.
The only one word I would add to what you said there, as far as trust is concerned, is respect.
Yes, exactly. Respect is also super, super important here, and it's really interesting how that plays out, because respect is also something that you look at from your own lens. I mean, I can really remember the last time I went on a beam trawler. I was on we were doing this survival study. So we would we would wake up at 6:30, be on deck at 7 to start doing the experiments, and then at 9:30 in the evening we would still be sitting behind our computers to put in all the data. We would be finished by 10. And it was really interesting because the fish said, "Oh, we really respect you, your working day is so long, it's amazing." And it was so funny because the two of us were like, "Oh my gosh, how can these fishers just every 2.5 hours the bell rings again and they have to get up for the next hole? And this just goes
That's
on
right.
and on and on." So we really respected their work ethics. And it's really
Yeah,
nice, being on the same vessel or being on the same boat actually shows you that,
but the
that we do things
important
in.
thing about trust and respect, which makes it work,
Exactly,
it's got to be both ways.
exactly, exactly. And it's also, one of the things, for example, in the Netherlands, we also invite the fishers as observer on the fish stock surveys, because the surveys are something that fishers there's always suspicions about the surveys, because of course we do the surveys in a standardized way. So we go to the same areas every year. We use fishing nets that have not changed since the 1960s because it has to be standardized to see differences from one year to the next. And of course, fishers, they go to sea because they want to catch as much as possible in an efficient way. So they improve their gears all the time. They go to areas where where they know from experience, they hope they can catch a lot. And that's very different from the way scientists fish. And we could never really get this, uh, get fishers to sort of understand, that a survey is a very, very different concept. So we said, okay, why don't you come and join us? And it was really scary for the scientists because they were like, oh, we're getting a fisher on board and he's going to criticize us and ask difficult questions. And it was lovely because after the week, the fisher's observer was like, oh, this is fantastic. I really understand now what the survey is about. I could ask the scientists all these questions. They work really hard. They actually measure the entire catch. It's really amazing. And the nice thing is, our fishing news actually wrote a short report every time a fisher observer has been on a survey, and that really also helped understanding amongst the fishing industry about why surveys are done in the way they're doing. And we started this 17 years ago, and still on the main surveys every year we have, for the full survey weeks, we have fishers observers on board, and that also helps the trust and the mutual respect, because I think it also I know it also helped my scientist colleagues who carry out the surveys to understand how much is at stake for the fishers in terms of, because these surveys are a super important part of the stock assessments. So by talking to the fishers, they also understand, oh, there is, livelihoods behind this work that we are doing. And I think that's something, having that kind of interaction, that is something that we should really foster, and we should do much and much more, because I think only together we can really achieve. If fishers and scientists work in isolation from each other, I think we're just not using, the best knowledge on both parts that we have.
That's great to hear. If I could maybe just take you back slightly to when you said about people questioning whether you could trust the fishermen or not. What went through my mind is, as I said, it's about trust and respect. And it goes both ways. Where I would have been a wee bit concerned about trusting with that one is the person that's questioning it, not the person you're talking about.
Yeah, you can imagine sometimes it's just really sort of from this question doesn't have to be, how do I say that in English? So this question about, can you trust the fishers or can you trust the data? It doesn't have to be necessarily be from some kind of malicious intent or whatever. Very often it's just because people don't know, and it's like curiosity how it works. Of course, there will always be parties who you have a certain agenda. Who will use the trust, or how can you trust those data as a way to forward their own agenda? But I must say, amongst the scientists that I've spoken to, for many of them, it's more the unknown and the curiosity and when you talk to them, oh, it's really interesting, and I would also really like to try that. And it's not because they have some hidden agenda or something. So it also means that you have to talk as fishers and also as scientists. You just have to talk to, be open to critical questions from people who are not necessarily maybe so aware about the benefits of working with fishers and how you can deal with quality and integrity issues. But that said, there will always be parties with a certain, who have a certain agenda, and maybe, that's something I think that you just have to deal with.
I love the way you talk about your interaction with fishers, because and I can just hear it even in your voice, that you have a respect and an appreciation for what you get, for what you give and what you get. And in any situation, as you say, whether it's with partners or with life in general, it's got to be give and take. It can never be one way.
Exactly. And I think that's also within the science community. I think that is similar. I mean, as a social scientist, I talk with fishers a lot, right? So and it's also, I see it as my job to make their knowledge available to fisheries biologists. And uh, and I really like, talking to fishers and going on boats, but that
Yeah.
should not be confused. Like sometimes people, like even colleagues in the biological sciences, for example, confuse this. They say, "Oh, but you're too passionate about fishers, and maybe you're just you're a bit pro fishers, for example." And then I say, "Yeah, but you're passionate about seals or passionate about cod or whatever species that they're working on. But that doesn't mean that you put the interest of the seals or the cod necessarily in front of your scientific responsibility." And that's the same for me. I can talk to fishers, I can be friends with fishers, I am friends with fishers, but as a scientist, of course, I do my work using uh, my training as a social scientist and all the methods that I've learned, in my training. Um, and that's okay. So you can still be passionate about fishers or about a certain species or whatever, as long as you do your science, yeah, in a sound way. I think that's the most important bit.
You're you're talking with somebody very like-minded just now, Natalie, because my last 20 years, my career was in a seafood restaurant I had owned in a place called Skrabster, on the north coast here. And it was a seafood restaurant, 100% seafood. And I used to still class myself as being in, I used to tell people I would still class myself as being in the fishing industry, not the hospitality industry, because for one, it was 100% seafood. And after 20 years, I still had more fisherman friends than chef friends. If I could ask you now, just asking about the comparison, because I've been so interested hearing what you say about ICES with the MSC, MCS, and WWF. That's Marine Stewardship Council, Marine Conservation Society, and Worldwide Fund. Is there is there a similarity in the sciences? Because there's a difference in the agendas, which a word you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think the main differences are, of course, ICES is a science organization. They don't have an opinion on which fish you should or shouldn't eat, or is a preferred choice. Which, for example, the Marine Conservation Societies, the fish guides, as we call them in the Netherlands. I'm not sure what they're called in English. Uh, um, so ICES basically is an organization who collects data, does stock assessment, and then based on the question that the European Commission or the UK or Norway asks, says, well, this is what they could catch based on the data and based on the management plan that was agreed um, by by the politicians. And what the Marine Stewardship Council and the fish choice, the consumer choice guides of MCS and WWF does, is they often use the data and the stock assessments that ICES does as part of their assessment of the sustainability of fisheries. So they actually use ICES information, and that's fine, because ICES information is public information. It's open. It's not. It's widely available. I think the main difference between the Marine Stewardship Council and the consumer seafood guides is that all of them look at sustainability from the perspective of how healthy is the stock, how well is the stock managed, and what are the impacts of the fisheries on the ecosystem. And the big difference is that the Marine Stewardship Council has set an international standard for that, and they also which is based on United Nations standards of the Food and Agriculture Organization, and they don't do the certification themselves. So it's a third-party assessment. And the Fish Consumer Guides by MCS and WWF, it's a self-assessment. So MCS and WWF, they have developed certain criteria for sustainable fisheries, and they also do the assessment of whether fisheries meet those criteria themselves. And with the MSC, that's very different. I mean, it's a third-party certifier who does that. There is also potential for stakeholders to follow the assessment, and also to provide comments, and also to, for example, to object against a decision that is being made. So that's a very, very different system, I think, in terms of transparency and conflict of interest, and also levels of participation of stakeholders. But yeah, those systems are very different again from ICES, because ICES just brings together the science, and they don't have an opinion on is this a preferred choice for a consumer to eat. That's not something that scientists, I think, is a responsibility for scientists. I think as a scientist, you should be very, very careful to keep your personal opinions, because of course everybody also has a personal opinion, to yourself, because you have to be independent, right?
It's striking me listening to you today, Natalie, because you talk about a respect and how you're with fishermen, and honestly, the fishermen here anyway, and from the way you talk, I'm quite sure they're the same in Holland. There's almost a fear about when some of that, like the MCS, WWF, when some of them get a hold of a statement of any kind, it's a damaging way they distort it, and they come out and they've got such a strong voice with the public, and I'll not be frightened to say it. It's almost corrupt, the way because it's all about money. And I, even at this restaurant I talked about, I've had people coming into the restaurant. Now, over the years we had the restaurant, this is not about me, but it's just stating a fact, we were number 6 in the top sustainable restaurants in the world. We were voted number 6 in the top 10 in the world on our sustainability. We've been the UK Sustainable Restaurant of the Year, the Scottish Sustainable Restaurant of the Year, and after all that, we would have somebody coming in and looking at the menu, and they would see cod and say, "Oh, I can't have that, it's not sustainable." We'd be saying, "Yes, it is." And so there was a distortion. But 2 points I was going to make on that one was, with the MCS, I was a so-called advisor with them, and they would, every so often, they would come on and ask for any comments or advice on that. And I have to say, I just thought, I wasn't comfortable, but I thought, well, we try to make it's my passion, it's my interest, the fishing industry is my life. I felt it's contributing something, it's hopefully going to be beneficial to the industry, but I can't honestly say that they ever took one bit of advice I give them. One of the things that I was really strongly against them on, there was a monkfish was a species, and And the other thing, before I come to that, I always felt this traffic light system they had, green was go, you can eat, if it's a species with green, you can eat anything you want, all as much as you want. If it's amber, you have to go easy with it. If it's red, you don't touch it. And I was always felt really strongly that, as we've discussed ourselves today, seafood, fish conservation is much more complex than 3 colours. Much more complex. And they had monkfish. The only monkfish they would recommend people eat, is if it's mature monkfish and it's caught by gill net. And I said to them, I said, look, gill net is one of the most damaging forms of fishing known around the world. And I give them facts, and the facts actually came from EU, from Brussels. And with gill net and long line, or the one, I can't remember the exact year, it would be probably about 2016, 17. The gill net and long line around the EU waters it killed between 400,000 to 500,000 mammals that were caught and killed. Not fish. It could be wader birds, seals, and that. So I said it's hugely damaging, and plus the fact if the nets break off, which there's no man-made fibre that can stand up to what the weather can throw at it. So if it breaks free, and it's going to be a rogue net, ghost fishing, and it'll never rot. So it's going to continue to catch fish. I said, it's such a damaging form of fishing, and there's you promoting it. But so I was really against that one. And with the MSC, we were asked to get chain of custody with the MSC in the restaurant. We had what was then Prince Charles, who's now our king. He was coming up to the area. It was an anniversary for them, so they wanted. We were a award-winning restaurant. The Prince was going to be in the area. They wanted us to do something, and we joined. So we got chain of custody with the MSC. We worked away with that until we got a situation where it was in the summer. We had mackerel on the menu. It was right bang in the season for mackerel. The local boats were out in the bay. I wouldn't say I could throw a stone and hit them, but I could see them just fishing in the bay outside. They would come in and I would get the mackerel, and the mackerel were so fresh, they were still kicking. And we had them in the menu. But we couldn't use MSC for that. We would have to get them frozen from Peterhead before we could use them. And they didn't recognise. So we had to get bulk frozen mackerel trucked from Peterhead rather than take what was caught within 200 metres of the restaurant landed. So I just thought, this is not for me. And it wasn't doing anything for the industry. It was. So I don't like their systems. And I'm even less happy about it when you tell me it's your information they're going away with and manipulating it for what suits them.
Well, I think what they're doing for the assessment is using ICES data on stocks, for example, but they also, of course, use data from other parties. So so that, of course, they're looking if a stock has been assessed by ICES, you can actually look at is it being used, is it at sustainable levels, and that's something that they then the both the MSC certifiers, but also the fish guides of MCS and WWF would use. But they also use lots of other information um, uh, for this, for example, for the ecosystem impacts and for the management advice. So it's based on a combination of yeah of data sources, of information sources, and yeah, what I prefer about the MSC is that it's a transparent system, and the standards it's a very it's very high standard. The bar is set very high for fisheries nowadays, and they also allow fisheries who are not completely perfect yet to become certified, provided they improve. And also that process is all transparent, and I really like that about it. Um, for me, it's I find it more difficult when I don't know what the assessment was like. But that's obviously a choice that is being made by the seafood, by the other seafood guides. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
One thing I would ask you, did you learn a lot from the North Sea Advisory Council in your time?
Yes. Yeah, it's actually very. This year, it's 20th anniversary of the North Sea Advisory Council. And I was in it right from the beginning. So when it was set up, and to me it was great because the North Sea Advisory Council and also its predecessor, the North Sea Fisheries Partnership, it was called. What was really nice was that there was this bonding between the different industries from the different countries around the North Sea, because there wasn't a lot of talking to each other. Like, people would meet each other maybe in Brussels during quota negotiations or things like that. But the nice thing about the advisory council was that you would actually have a couple of days together, and then also, of course, like in the evening, the social events, people would go to the for dinner together, have some drinks in the bar, and then that's where a lot of relationship building and bonding starts. And fishers, I remember at the time, in the beginning, there were actually a couple of still active fishers members, because they were representatives of national fisheries organizations. Um, I remember very well, from the UK, Arnold Locker and Fred Normandale, and then there was Fleming Christensen from Denmark, and Wim de Boer from the Netherlands. Fleming and Wim, unfortunately, they both passed away, but they became, through these meetings, they really started bonding and saying, like, look, we are all fishers, and it doesn't really matter which country we are from. We have to work together, and we have to make sure that the best management advice is being given to the managers, and also we have to work together towards with the scientists. They really realized that it didn't really matter where you're from. You're all fishing in the same pond on similar species, and you're working with you're having experiencing also the same challenges, like quota cuts or new approaches to management. And now, for example, offshore wind is something, I think, that is wind farming is something that really impacts fishing, whatever nationality they're from. And that, I think, was a great thing in the North Sea AC, in those advisory council, in those first days, like just the bonding and the realization we really have to work together on this. We're in the same boat.
Yeah. I think it's just what you've been saying all along, how you feel it's worked so well for it to be bonding and people working together and communicating.
Yeah. And of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that then further down, the chain, so to speak, your advice or your science is being taken up, because that was also one of the frustrations in the North Sea Advisory Council in the beginning, was that the Commission wasn't really used to getting advice, united advice from the fishing industries around the North Sea, with also NGOs on board. So this for them was also something that was very new. So particularly in the beginning, a lot of the advice from the advisory councils didn't actually make it into eventual policy decisions. But that is something that I think also changed. So there is. And that comes back to what I was saying in the beginning. Fishers very often expect that change is immediate when you start working together with each other or with fishers, but it often takes a little bit of time. So there needs to be some patience involved as well, and that's sometimes really difficult. I mean, I'm an impatient person myself, so I appreciate it. But particularly when your business is on the is at stake, you yeah, certainly you want to have as quick as possible a good decision. You don't want to wait, but sometimes, yeah, it's just how it goes. Things change requires time.
Fishermen, I think you're referring to, they call it real time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And do you not think that's good or?
Well, it is. I mean, and I also I understand the frustration. For example, when fishers suddenly see a stock increasing, right? They are the first ones to see this in their catches, but science is always running a year behind. So the scientists don't necessarily pick up these big, these changes that are happening within in the current year. And I think that's also why we need to start thinking about how can we deal with actually that kind of information as well. And there is no system for that as yet, not within ICES, but also not within the European Union, and I probably also not in the UK. I think in your current constellation, but it's something that I think we should start thinking about. Like, how do we deal with direct information from at sea? And it's not only in I think in terms of the positives, in terms of fishers seeing that catches are improving, which is not necessarily immediately picked up by scientists, but it could also be when fishers see something is wrong. And we've had situations, of course, and I mean, I think the example of the northern cod in Canada, the collapse of the biggest cod fishery in the world on the Grand Banks, that was something that inshore fishers were actually predicting. They were actually noticing that things were going wrong, and they were not, taken seriously by the scientists because their models didn't yet show what was going on. So I think that they learned a very hard lesson there, because the fishery collapsed. It was closed. Lots of jobs got lost. Communities were lost, and the stock still hasn't recovered because basically the management measures were taken when it was already too late. And I think that is something that we should avoid at all cost, and we should learn from those lessons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, there's a saying in this country, where there's a will, there's a way.
Yes.
And I would definitely say your point there, there's a will with Scottish fishermen, UK fishermen, but definitely with Scottish fishermen to contribute and work with yourselves. So you can certainly, that message comes over to me loud and clear every fisherman I'm talking to.
Yeah, and
So
that's really good. That's really good to hear. And I'm quite sure that my colleagues in Scotland at the science at the Marine Lab are also really happy to hear that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Natalie, to pull things up,
Hmm.
could I ask you where? I mean, you've obviously done a huge amount of work, and I've read a lot of your papers and things. Where can people look to see what you and learn and what you do, and where you do it?
Okay, so that's obvious. I am obviously on LinkedIn, social media platform where people can follow me, and there is also all the scientists who work at the university the institute where I work. They have their own web page with all the publications that they have, and that's not only scientific publications, but it's also reports and articles in the Dutch fishing news, which unfortunately are in Dutch, but that's also an outlet where you could find information. And then I'm on Twitter, on X, I should say, where I'm still active. So that's also another way of hooking up.
I've looked at got some of your papers on there. Did you call it Twitter? I would still call it Twitter.
I also still call it Twitter. I just corrected myself to X because I thought, it's officially called X, but I call it Twitter. So if people want to, to get in touch, they can do, and they have a Twitter account. They can follow me, and I'll make sure to respond. So my name is and then Nathalie Steins on Twitter.
Nathalie, I am so grateful and really enjoyed your very upbeat view on the industry, and it's quite encouraging, very encouraging. We have a saying here, which I'm sure you'll know and may probably use in Holland. We would class you as a glass half full person.
I think that you hit it spot on, because that's also how I would see myself. We have the same expression in the Netherlands.
Excellent, because the other way is a glass half empty.
Yes, exactly.
It's just how different people see the same thing.
True. I am of the half full type. Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked it, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a 5-star review. And if you want to speak with me, visit seafoodmatterspodcast.com.